Excellent. Great. Well, thank you very much.
And you're off.
Great to be here. And it's great to see so many people. It's nice to be back in the SCiO fold. Many of you, given that there's a level of interest in Stafford Beer's work, will recognize Designing Freedom as the title of a little book by Stafford Beer, and both Jane and I have been strongly influenced by his work over the years. Freedom together was a phrase that I picked up from a book by Matthew Barzan called The Power of Giving Away Power, where he just makes the point, just reminding people you can't be free. You can't be free alone. Freedom is a collective condition. So we concatenated these into create Designing Freedom Together, which really reflects the approach that we took in the work that we're talking about tonight. So this really, I'd like this to be an invitation to join us on a journey. This work has been published, so it's broadly in the public domain. There's some additional methodological detail here tonight for this audience, but we're very happy to share that in the interests of mutual learning with the people here. I mean, feel free to throw rocks at what we've done here. We'd like to learn by being challenged as well as supported. And if you do want to add thoughts as we're going along in the chat, please do. And then hopefully we'll have a bit of time at the end to take some questions and comment. So I can't know what you're going to get out of this. And feel free to share as we go along, not in the chat, as I say. I see so much of people trying to fix problems out of context. And we believe that what we've got here is a practical contribution to creating new paths to vitality. You can make your own judgments about that. The overall thing, so generically, I'll talk generically first and then more specifically, this is about, it's a participative process of visioning and a process of design in which people essentially focus on the choice of boundaries and indeed the meaning of boundaries. I think one of the key things in here is about reframing boundaries as interfaces of mutual learning rather than as things to be, immutable objects to be overcome. And that's embedded in the whole process. We were interested here in transformation rather than just efficiency improvement. So in the modeling that we've done, citizens are at the heart of it, in the full richness of their lives and their contexts, which in many organizational environments is quite a shift actually to do that in a deep way. We weren't analyzing an existing system. We were visioning here, designing a future system. What needs to be happening? What would we like to be happening in future? And both of us we hold out for the possibility of deeply democratized organizational forms. And I think that did infuse the way in which we went about doing the work and our assumptions about what's possible. And we think that's fully consistent with Beer's VSM. Although in this work, questions of how to organize come later. We're talking about a systemic view of the wider context in which this particular organization was playing roles. So it's almost like doing the pre-work to pre-structure to enable emergence to flourish, if you like. So to get more specific, the work was sponsored by Transport for Greater Manchester. So it started a couple of years ago and went into 2021, very much triggered by COVID. So huge changes in travel demand due to COVID and then associated public sector funding challenges, and also a whole load of really quite major new responsibilities coming down the track for the organization. So they were the presenting issues. Whilst there being an ongoing commitment to the really quite well-developed regional transport strategy, which is a vision-led strategy. So we were kind of playing into an organizational context which understood and has developed some processes in vision-led strategy development. And this was taking that kind of approach to a further level of sophistication, I would say. So a change program, so-called, was set up, which had a number of different chunks of activity. This was focusing on what we called the aspiring work stream, aspiring to a desired future, and then there were other work streams obviously interdependent work streams around the potential for reshaping the organization for new responsibilities, and then the critical issue of also embedding more consistently processes of continuous improvement across the organization. So we were kind of trying to get our arms around the whole thing as part of this change program. And what we were trying to do here was prototype a new design approach, recognizing that what we were doing was somewhat at odds with the embedded practices in the organization, but stepping into that with our eyes open on the basis that if we did something new, that where there were friction points with existing approaches, there were opportunities to learn in that. And it was all done under the umbrella of the change program, so we were able to create some space to do it. We were very aware all the way through that, or became increasingly aware, I guess, that our personal preferences differed rather from those of the formal culture. But we felt as though there was a significant match with at least the stated intent for change in the organization as a whole, and people were being encouraged to think outside the box and think differently, etc. So in specifically around personal preferences, definitely a strong preference for iterative approaches rather than linear approaches, deep and broad involvement rather than top-down imposition, and taking an outside-in approach rather than inside out. Now, obviously, there is balance in all things, but I guess we took at one level took an extreme approach towards iterative, broad involvement and outside in to counterpoint against some other approaches which might be more institutionally embedded. And we, all the way through, we saw ourselves as participants in the wider system and recognized our own biases. And we've written the paper, there's a link at the end here, to the paper in the first person from our own perspectives, to try and hold the recognition that we did not see ourselves as outside the system, and our own kind of hopes and fears and ways of seeing the world and everything is all woven into what we were doing. There were 4 objectives stated in the paper around prototyping. So there's a methodology here around co-design of a whole system architecture, or a systemic architecture, which Jane will talk about in a bit more detail next. It's about laying the foundations for a transition strategy, very much plugging back into the regional transport strategy, which picks up common themes around transport integration for seamless services, as well as sustainability in all its forms and inclusion, etc. But actually achieving that in practice is not the work of the moment. So we were very much plugging back into that published intent, whilst demonstrating the value of collaboration between different people through this whole thing, and also holding a view that self-understanding and self-development is part of the mix here. That actually the ability to turn up with other people who you don't normally work with, not knowing what the answer is, and work together is something that takes some practice. And so we were kind of holding the recognition that what we were trying to do was not always very easy. And therefore there was a level of pretty strong facilitation and hosting needed to make this work, as well as the more kind of technical stuff. A number of people have asked me, well, asked both of us, so what enabled this to be done? And we challenged ourselves when we were writing the paper to think about what is it that we actually did. And this is a quote from the paper. What we were doing was neither a solution to a specific problem, nor a solution looking for a problem, but an approach to collectively reframing the understanding of the whole situation to enable new questions to be asked, new opportunities to be found, and new ways of working to emerge. That's not normally the kind of thing that organizations commission, in my experience. So I think it's a reasonable question to ask, how on earth did you manage to do this? Part of the answer to that is the fact that I had been working as a consultant on and off for a number of years in TFGM, and therefore had built up a range of relationships and a level of trust with people throughout the organization at all levels, actually. So, and then we had the protection of a change program, which had a level of tone to it, which was about experimentation and thinking outside the box and pushing the boundaries to a certain extent. So that provided an umbrella for a period of time to try some new things. So finally, from me for now, one of the critical things, I mentioned the issue about boundaries earlier on. So the whole process of rethinking, reconceptualizing boundaries as interfaces of mutual learning, whilst also challenging where the lines are, where the boundaries between chunks of activity are, is at the heart of why this approach can be transformational. When it says on this, I found this this picture on the web. It says, framing the landscape, many people look, but only a few see. I'm not sure I entirely agree with that, because everybody sees. It's just that we see in different ways, or see differently, and see different things. But one of the things we noticed, we not only did we do this big picture systemic thinking that we're reporting here, we also did some coaching of a number of people across the organization to teach them the method so that they could use the approach for specific areas of concern that they were interested in. And so through that process, we had quite a bit of experience with a number of different people who were coming at their issues from different directions. And there were a number of instances of people experiencing the shift in perspective, and in particular that shift from a focus on me and my team to getting glimpses of a wider system of activity, which then provides the ability to ask the question about, okay, so what individual roles and team roles, or indeed organizations and organizational roles, might be needed to make that future system work. And we found that some people found that completely liberating, and just, oh wow, thank goodness we can now see the bigger picture. And some people found it really quite disconcerting. As I've said, it's the shift in perspective which underpins the potential for transformation here. So I'll hand over to Jane at that point. Who's going to tell us a bit more about the detailed methodology.
Okay, so well, we started with this quote from Bucky to say that to change something, to build a new model and make the existing model obsolete. And we certainly took that on board. And our approach was to pull from the future, not to push from the current position. So what we were trying to do here, and I thought what I'm going to describe is the big, full, envisaged method, even though we didn't do all of it. And then I'll talk a little bit about some of the bits that we did do and the architecture we developed. And then what we actually were able to put in the paper was very, very little about method, because it wasn't the main area of interest to the people who would be reading it in the journal that published it. So this bit in here is an opportunity to talk about method in a way that we weren't able to do in the paper. So what we were trying to do is to create a pull from the future and to give everyone agency to be part of co-creating that future. So we used the 3 horizons method. I hope that most of you have sort of heard of that. It's, if you haven't, horizon 3 is representing the future, the vision. And the idea was to work on the vision with no concerns about boundaries or whatever until a much later stage, but to understand how what activities would be needed in the future and how they would be connected together, how they would interact together in order to form a coherent system, regardless of any boundaries. So that was horizon 3. Then we have horizon 1, which in traditional 3 horizons method is the position today. But instead of modeling the position today, what we were doing was looking at the current activities and decanting them into the shape of the future vision, keeping all the bits that was doing all the right things already, but reshaping how they were connected together into a visionary way, such that we could then move forward to the second horizon, which is the changes that are needed. And therefore, having got some of the current organizations, the important parts of it that are still needed into the new shape, you might be adding extra connections and extra bits into things in various numbers of change initiatives in order to move forward to achieving the third horizon, having already restructured within the shape that you're aiming for. So that's the overall thinking behind the method. So moving on to a little bit more about the steps in that. So the first step was to look at what the purpose of the system was. What are the purposes of this system? And we did 2 things that were, I suppose, people thought were quite strange and unusual. One of which was, we said, we're not talking about the organization, we're talking about the whole system. We're talking about transporting Greater Manchester, not the TFGM organization that had commissioned the work specifically. So, and the second thing was to put the public, the citizens, the travelling, absolutely bang in the middle of that system in focus, not sitting around the outside in the context. So the system in focus became clearer and the boundaries got sorted out as we moved along, because we looked in more detail at what the activities were about and decided through that to make it broader or smaller, and it moved around quite a lot. And then we'd go back and rework the purpose statement until we got the system in focus and the purposes aligned. And that was sort of creating the model of the system. And to note, there are no who does what in this, and there is no organizational detail. We left that out at this stage. This is all done before you get to thinking about organization. So this is just a little illustration of the sort of model which is showing activities and collaboration between activities. And having a model that is necessary to operate within the vision at a fairly high level. And moving on to the next step. Mm-hmm. In the method, we would have then gone on to do work on the viable system model in terms of organizing. And because we're talking about a whole system here and not an organization, of course, we will have multiple viable system model structures in this. We did do some work on that area, but haven't been able to report on that yet in the paper that we wrote. So we're talking tonight, focusing more on the steps 1 and 2 there.
Okay.
Yeah. So what we've got here is the breakdown, the very high level view of what systems, what VSM structures we would be looking at. And we had the area around providing services and the area around providing infrastructure and the living the life of citizens. And those were the three main areas that we were looking at. And we had this activity matching needs and services that would sit completely on the boundary between citizens and the Transport Authority, and would be a collaborative activity to identify what was needed. And yeah, I think that's it. So that's a traditional VSM picture. And the idea would have been that having got to that stage, there would be an understanding of purposes for each bit of those organisations, and they could take the work away and come up with their own operating model for their own part of the story, given the purposes for the activity that they would be fulfilling, and could then work in parallel to move that forward. So the implementation we saw very much following on the lines of Etienne and the trainer.
Bev and Etienne Wenger trainer.
Trainers, that's it, yeah. A lot of words there. And who do this work on systems convening. But what they tend to do is to start on the ground and just spot a system and work it within that. And our idea was that same technique could be used within the scope of identified systems within the overall solution to actually enable everyone to get involved in moving it forward. So that's looking through the method in a bit more detail. And we were able to do this in terms of getting a pull from the future forward, because we had a number of the people who've been involved in developing the TFGM strategy, which is in fact a strategy for the whole of transport in Greater Manchester and not just a strategy for TFGM. And they all came and joined in, along with volunteers from all across the organisation, and were able very easily to translate their strategy ideas into an architectural view of what would be needed and what that vision would look like. So we had a lot of help from that. That's it, Roger.
Have we got, there's that final, sorry.
Yeah, I've just talked to that one.
Covered that, yeah.
Yeah.
Super.
Okay, thank you. So, I'm now going to just describe the very top level of that architecture quickly. So, we took the quote here: "Model is neither true nor false; it's more or less useful," from Stafford Beer, which means a model is neither right nor wrong; it's just useful. And that was the point of it, getting everyone involved in creating a vocabulary that worked for them and enabled them to discuss the future in a way that was making sense between them, so that you could really make it solid and make it feel that this is something that could pull you forward to it. So the top level that we've got here, this is the purpose that we ended up with, which was living lives enabled by connectivity, both transport and digital, for Greater Manchester. And that was the scope of the system in focus that we came up with to work with. And of course, the context in which all of that happens. So 2 parts to that. First, living and thriving in Greater Manchester. As we said, the whole of the citizens of Greater Manchester and their travelling needs are in the centre of this model. And then the activity of connecting people and community and places. And what we realised was that the most key activity that goes on here that decides what's happening is choosing how to connect. And this is an activity that happens on that line between the two. So choosing how to connect is a piece of collaboration where the citizen knows where they want to go to at a particular time. And the service providers, if you like, and the actual travelling will interact with that understanding in order for the citizen to reach a stage where they can actually choose how they're going to connect. And we then were able to look into all these factors that might affect that and therefore would shape the overall system. Yeah. So this is just filling out the other things that we brought into the system in focus. First of all, developing the urban form with respect to connectivity, which is really about where are people going to live, and where will they choose to live, and how does that affect the transport system. We've got protecting the natural environment with respect to connectivity, and put a lot of thought into carbon budgets as a resource to be bargained with, looking at the pollution of transport as a resource that there could be targets for, that could be, so that all of those things could be supported by the system in an advisory mode to citizens when they make the decision about how they're going to travel. And providing and using energy we brought into this system because we were doing a visionary piece of work. We thought that the transitions in energy are probably going to be absolutely key to the future of how the transport evolves. So that was the sort of scope of the system in focus, and we went then zoomed into various areas, including quite a lot of detail about the design of the urban form and some stuff about antisocial behaviour, which ended up being travelling without fear, and various areas that we were able to get volunteers who knew a lot about to contribute. So that was the architecture. So just to illustrate it, I'd like to quickly explain that the idea of the architecture is that anyone can look at that and say, how does my story fit with this? How does this represent my vision of the future? So quickly, when I was living in Leek in Staffordshire, my employer asked me to move and go to work in Manchester every day. And at the time, the buses were dreadful, and I had ended up having to, had to drive in a petrol car. I had to go on a train to Manchester, and then I had to catch a bus that was using petrol again. It really wasn't a very good journey. So in my future vision for that journey, I would start thinking about all the new forms of transport, the more renewable forms of transport, energy that could be used in transport to do that journey. I would be thinking about how I could work from home 4 days a week, which is now possible and wasn't at that time. So digital clearly has to be part of the transport strategy. And also, of course, the active transport opportunities that are being brought in. And when I get to work, I might want to volunteer to be part of a group that are actually advising on the impacts of transport options on work, and liaising with the Transport Authority in terms of what sort of services they offer. So that was just my vision of, how I might illustrate the decisions that are made. And I would expect to have an advisor, to be able to get an advisor when I'm doing a new journey to advise me on the carbon impacts and the pollution impacts of my choices. So that was my vision. But if I was a bus driver, I might say, well, I'm looking forward in the future to be driving on my all-electric bus. And what I'm thinking is that it would be really good if I was given a shift now and again to just travel on the bus as an individual citizen and to talk to people and to follow up on my own projects from the things that I'd seen that weren't working very well, and talk to people and take that back to the office and meet up with the other bus drivers, and we would decide what was needed in order to make a better service, and we could help each other, and we'd all develop our own skills, you know, because we're actually being much more involved with the public rather than just driving a bus, and we could help each other to develop. So that's my illustration of how a couple of people might use this architecture just to think of narratives about their vision for the future. So the quote at the bottom here, once you've got this, you can get future ready by thinking about how to organize things, came from the supervisor of a multimodal interchange in Manchester. And he just looked at this and thought, actually, if you got this far, you could work out how to organize it. And it was a brilliant introduction to the VSM. It was really good that he'd made that leap and was, you know, involved with thinking that way.
Great, next one.
Mm-hmm. So finally, designing is enabling everyone to be both choreographers and dancers. That's what we think it's all about. And we tend to think that quite often you've got a linear design process where someone does some design and then someone decides what to do and then do some doing and then you do some learning. In fact, everyone in the organization ought to have their own little learning loop around designing, doing, designing, deciding, doing and learning. And by collaborating together locally around local issues, we can move towards the longer term vision. We believe that many of our design systems do not optimally serve the best interests of all people and life in general, and that humans can change what humans have designed.
Great. Thanks, Jane. So back to me. I'm going to do just a couple more slides of wrap up, and then I've noticed there are various questions and we can have a bit of a discussion about some of the things that have come up for you. But one of the things that we found helpful while we were going through this, and this is partly based on my experience of having worked in this organization and similar organizations, was that it feels like there's a culture associated with the formal structures and a rather different culture associated with informal networks of, you know, connections between people across the organization and outside as well. And that was just, it was a helpful distinction for us in terms of tapping into, if you like, people's inherent human desire and need to be sociable with one another, regardless of what the formal structures and formal boundaries might tend to influence people towards. However, you know, we became, or we're always aware of the fact that there's always a risk by drawing that distinction that you end up orienting around rather than allowing change to or transformation of the existing formal approach to organization. Now, we didn't get as far as thinking about the organizational form formally here, but we were building in you know, the possibility for shifts to much more distributed forms of decision making and governance, and much more collaborative approaches to design and decision making through the whole organization. And then the ever-present issue of do not muddle up the map of the territory, which you will, I guess, this audience will be very familiar with. And I think also one of the things that I became acutely aware of here was the fact that we were trying to get our arms around a systemic description of the wider landscape in which this particular organization and a whole range of other organizations and citizens play roles, which kind of can give people delusions of grandeur and claims to comprehensiveness. But of course, no model can ever be comprehensive, so we need to watch that all the way through. So we've put some additional commentary in the paper about that issue. So what? I noticed somebody asked what's been implemented as a result of this. The main so what, I would say, is that for those people who engaged in the process, there were unexpected insights, which kind of feels soft and indirect, and in a way is, but is also enormously important that we did manage to create a collaborative and social context here in which new discoveries could be made about, do you know what, I've never thought about it in that way before. So that whole process of, I guess, enabling multiple people to take different perspectives into the wider system. And that is in spite of the fact that for this work that we did, only people from inside TFGM were involved. Now, our aspiration absolutely was to expand, to have citizens, to have members of whatever, bus operating companies, train operating companies, other transport players, local authorities, etc., other stakeholders in the system, which is how the thing would then develop to become more useful as a touch point for people to decide where do we need to be working together more effectively, where do we need to create deeper collaborative interactions across the system. I think, as Jane's already indicated, we did some additional work beyond what we're reporting here and has been written up to explore a potential structure for a fully integrated regional transport system, a visionary structure for that, and then from that doing the organizing job, outlining possible adaptive and distributed governance and organizational arrangements. So using the viable system model as a lens as a way of doing that design, so VSM in design mode rather than in diagnostic mode. And the way in which Jane and I characterize what the VSM is all about is that it's provides an architecture to support ongoing and emergent change. So we did do that, but it's not, it kind of didn't bite at the time, but that work is there available for those who wish to pick it up. And we're left feeling, well, there is a role for the growth of informal networks, which could influence the co-creative design of different formal structural and organizational arrangements. And I can, imagine a feedback process of that reinforcing a more collaborative culture, which is more aligned with the formal structures, with more distributed authority and mutual learning, etc. All of which is kind of in the list of desires, but remain tough nuts to crack in terms of how things are currently structured in most organizations. I'm not talking just about this one by any means. We can't predict the details, but and I do not underestimate the challenge of existing patterns of organizing, but I think particularly given the the shake that many organizations have been given over the last couple of years, I do remain hopeful for green shoots of positive, more integrative change going on all over the place. So finally, last slide here, which you can refer to, is just a link to the paper which we published in December, which provides a bit more detail on what we've been talking about here. So thank you very much. I think probably if I stop sharing, we've got, well, a good 10 minutes for discussion, at least, I think.
Yeah, thanks, Roger. Thanks, Jane. Really, really interesting. I shall be, as a sort of Manchester dweller, I'm kind of interested in how that's going to develop as well. About 10 minutes, absolutely. I'm conscious the questions start at about 1852. So I don't know whether, Roger, you want to start picking any of those up, or there are any particular ones that sort of stimulate you or Jane to have a response to those in any particular way?
Gan, is that the best way of doing it? 1852.
Sally's the first.
Net
zero.
zero.
Net zero.
So, I mean, yes, there is an absolute recognition that, you know, if you go for if you go through the process of looking at carbon budgets at the current rate of going through that carbon budget, it's going to be eaten up in, you know, well, I'm not going to give you the number because I'm not sure if it's been public domain, but you know, you can eat through the carbon budget very quickly without some really radical changes. So I mean, if you track what's going on in transport, there's huge focus on active travel, huge investment in Greater Manchester into cycle lanes and, you know, cycling and walking, and encouraging people, not only TFGM, excuse me, but other organizations involved in getting people active. But then, you know, there was it was an interesting process to talk about in this work the connectivity system, if you like, thinking about connectivity as a whole. And we were helped because of COVID that everybody was experiencing that interplay between physical connectivity and virtual connectivity, and, you know, plotting these graphs of here's just transport for you. Whoa, you know, we were up here and suddenly whang, it's gone to nothing. But of course, if you then show the virtual connectivity fills in the gaps. Now, people weren't doing that, but it was creating a way of pointing to, well, why aren't we thinking about this more holistically? So that's a kind of an example of an insight that was coming out of this way of thinking. And then when you think just holistically about what's going on the boundaries between connectivity and the wider context, well, provision of energy for connectivity as a whole is a great space that we need to dive into here, which then raises all those issues around transition to net zero. Absolutely.
Roger, can I pick up on one that just followed up fairly quickly from that, but was actually from Ian, which is about the tension between design and constraint and freedom?
Yeah.
Because I think that's a particularly interesting question about the subject, I suppose.
Well, I think you know, Stafford Beer was playing in with the idea of designing freedom. I mean, the way that I have learnt these methodologies from Jane, who's been developing them for 35 years or something, and I'd like to hope that I've made a small contribution to developing the processes and making them work in wider contexts. And I think what I feel is that the way I've come to describe it to myself is that I used to think about design as something that we do to the world, if you like, and kind of pattern recognition is something that is out there and we notice. And there's a real kind of interplay between patterning, an active process of patterning, which is also, if you like, an active process of designing, which is about, if we choose to draw a distinction here, holding a recognition that we've now created an interface of mutual learning. How useful is that? Where's that going to take us? I don't know whether that's any kind of answer.
Yeah.
So Ian, that was you that asked the question. I can see you, so you're doing that. So go on, Jane.
I was just going to say that the approach that we took was to have a process that was based on learning rather than teaching when it came to the method, and engaging with the volunteers. And after the end of the session, where there'd been a lot of debate about whether it would be good to draw a boundary here or a boundary there, I'd just follow it up with a little handout explaining how you might decide which way to do it. You know, and this was really the process that we went through. And we had people from help desks and all sorts of activities within the organisation. And the more frontline the work they were, the more they actually loved the method.
Interesting. That's very interesting. There was an interesting question. We only got a couple of minutes really, just for maybe last one or two questions, Roger and Jane. But an interesting one came from Maya, which was just asking really about how you managed to sort of link using VSM and Three Horizons, how that sort of interlinkage worked in terms of Three Horizons as a way of getting people to look forward, and VSM as a way of structuring and thinking about the... Well,
the Three Horizons we used is for the overall method, just so that we've got a vocabulary for talking about the future, the current work that's going on, and the stages to get there. And it's a common vocabulary that people were able to use quite easily. So that was really just overall architecture. The next level down was the activity modeling we did, that was to do with connectivity and how the various how to create modular activities and how to connect them together, if you like. And then sorry, where have I got to? What was the last bit about?
Well, the other bit was just, Jane, how you kind of linked that Three Horizons bit to using VSM. So you kind of explained Three Horizons.
So we used the activity modelling and the connectivity to draw a map on the ground of the activities that would be needed to support the vision, and the way they needed to connect together to make a coherent system. And then we said, okay, having done all this work, we're now in a position to say, what sort of organisation would suit this? And that's where we took the step and said, well, okay, how many VSM stacks would we need? And what would they be sent? What would be the purpose of each of those stacks from the activities we had? And came up with a very different actual design in practice, because there's so many practical things that come in when you think about VSM that don't come in when you just think about pure activities. But we had all our system ones already defined and already identified how they needed to link together on the ground. And we were just able to decamp those out of the model, put them on the ground in a clean model and say, how would we organize this?
Thank you.
Can I just pick up one more question? It's a quick answer. Andrew Warner was asking about timescales here. Actually, how long were we doing this for? So I was involved in architecting designing the change program, which launched in August 2020 formally, and we managed to get Jane. So I was then starting to think about this kind of approach, given the work that Jane and I had been doing previously, and we managed to. So I was employed at TFGM actually at the time, and we managed to get Jane in as a consultant for a period of about 6 weeks or something in sort of February and March, in the lead up to the end of the financial year. So the majority of the kind of the real work was done in an incredibly intense period over about 6 months. But we've been doing, you know, quite a lot of shaping the way in which it would work for about 4 or 5 months in advance of that, probably.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you to Roger and to Jane for a very stimulating presentation and some good questions arising from everyone. Thank you for those.